Welcome to NewYorkBIOs Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Shwen Gwee, VP and Head of Global Strategy at Bristol Myers Squibb.
All right, Shwen, it is fantastic to have you today. We get excited about things like this because I think in all of kind of digital health and biopharma, you're probably one of the people that has been there and done that and kind of seen it happen and seen it evolve. So that's one of the reasons we're really excited about today. So we tend to kick things off with a little bit of an origin story. So why don't you wind back the clock a little bit, and why don't we talk about really how you got into digital health in the first place?
Sure. Thanks, Derek. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me on. And probably the reason I've been there and done that is because I've just been around for a long time, right? And so I've seen it evolve.
Don't tell anybody.
You won't tell.
Just to give some background, I've been in the biopharma industry for almost 20 years now. And prior to that, I was actually training to be a behavioral neuroscientist. So I started on the bench side doing research in behavioral neuroscience and drug addiction. And then moving over, I guess, to some people may call it the dark side, right? Joining the pharma industry. One short stint in between was actually continuing medical education. I will say that, when I started doing my undergrad and grad school programs was just around the advent of the internet. So that's how far back I go. And so what happened there was I actually taught myself HTML because I thought it was really cool to have this connected world, and ended up doing a lot of side gigs to, get what people would call beer money as a poor grad student, and designing basically websites for different departments and so on. Mm-hmm. So I was doing a lot of that. And in grad school, I actually went to University of Cambridge in England. I was part of a group called Biology and Business, where essentially it was knowledge transfer, translational medicine, whatever you want to call it. But how do you get the research that we're doing in our labs out into reality? This was before the term startup was even coined, I think. And so I was really starting to get involved with how students take what they know into the real world sort of place and start a company as a result of that. So we had pitch competitions, we had events like life science fairs and stuff like that. And so it was the start of me really getting involved with, number one, digital, and number two, startups, right, at that time. Mm-hmm. And so from there, when I was done with grad school, I started my first job. I actually started in a continuing medical education company where my job was actually to translate CME, continuing medical education, from traditional to online. So really starting to move everything digitally. And some of the things I did were, this was before the iPod as well. So not just iPhone, but before the iPod. I was starting to take what they used to put on audio CDs as continuing medical education audio tracks, and they used to sell them as CME materials.
Yeah.
I converted those to MP3, put them on an what they called an MP3 player, which later became the iPod, and then sold those as CME sort of packages. And so that was really the start of me starting to get into that crossover between digital and health and sciences and life sciences. And then ended up getting hired by one of our clients in a pharma company and moving to Boston from there. And so that's kind of how I got into pharma. And in pharma, because I started doing this MP3 stuff, this audio CDs, I also started getting into social media. So the first thing was podcasting, and believe it or not, the first era of podcasting was 2004, 2005, around there, meeting all these people where we were all gathering and going, wait, talk a little bit louder so we can hear your voice. And then we would recognize them because we couldn't see them at the time. There was no YouTube, right? So there was a lot of that. And then from there went to blogging and, Twitter and Facebook later on. But that was what the pharma company pulled me in to do, was how do you leverage social media to connect with our field teams? That's really the start of digital coming into the pharma industry. And from there, once I got there, I realized that nobody actually knew what the heck I was talking about, right? I talked to besides this one guy who wanted it. And by the way, I was in the medical affairs department at the time because he wanted me to connect with his field teams, the MSLs, the medical science liaisons.
Yep.
And
I was going to ask you where you sat. So you were in the commercial organization.
but within medical affairs,
But
not
within
even
medical
commercial,
affairs.
not
Yeah.
the marketing organization.
Yeah.
And so very quickly, once I realized IT, legal, and all the other important players had no idea what I was talking about, I realized I'm not sure how long I have this job for, because nobody knows how to do or what to do with what I got. And there aren't even any rules about this right now. So I didn't even know the regulations around it. So I had to figure out really quick what to do. And I ended up changing my job a little, running what they called Speakers Bureau. So I basically worked with all the doctors that spoke on our behalf for the respiratory franchise, but I was also the default digital guy. And at that point, that's when they started moving my group, the Speakers Bureau group, from Med Affairs to marketing, because it became a promotional event.
Yeah.
And then they realized in marketing that I knew this digital thing. So they're like, hey, you can help us with this thing because we don't know if we should have a website or not. And so I ended up becoming the guy that by default, started pushing websites. I started working with early startups then called Yahoo and Google, bringing
Those
them in.
scrappy little players.
Yes. Bringing them in and introducing them to the companies, going, you need to use these guys. And they're like, why? Who are they? But that was the start of it all. And this was probably 2006, maybe 2007, launched the company's first website for a respiratory brand, launched the brand, got them into that space. And that's how it all started from a digital marketing standpoint. Now, because in those days, there was no such term as digital health. There was Web 2.0, there was Health 2.0 even. The idea of digital, other than the internet or the websites and social media maybe, was about as much as we had. And social media was a place where I actually met a lot of people in healthcare, but not just in pharma. So I met providers, payers, patients, and all that. And the patients finally had a voice that they could talk to, they could connect with each other, that especially rare diseases, like, wait, I found somebody else who's just like me.
Right.
So there was a lot of conversation around that. And so it became such an interesting place to learn about what patients really feel, what doctors really feel, what providers are talking about. So it became this connection point where we were learning as well. And that led to then saying, okay, wait, we're just building websites right now, but what else can we do to really help these people who are saying here that these are all the challenges they're having in their life with this health condition? So that's where it really started to make, even though I was digital marketing and pushing a lot of these messages and positioning and branding, a lot of it was also like, okay, what else can we do to really meet the needs of these people and help them with the conditions that they have and as they go along the journey? And that's kind of the start of how it all happened. For me, was really starting to think that way. And then when I moved to the next company, I literally was meant to come in and do what they called Health 2.0. This was 2008. And that was things like chloride sweat bands, so that we could measure the amount of chloride in your sweat and know whether you actually need to take some type of medication or not. And so there's things like that, but that was really the advent of how I got into this space and the things I was doing to really start to drive these marketing on one side, but also I guess what we would call beyond the pill type experiences and digital health opportunities in those days.
It's funny that you mentioned Health 2.0. I had to kind of rewind and like, oh yeah, I remember people talking about Health 2.0. And then I was trying to figure out really what it was.
There was the term, and then there was the actual event, right? There was the Health 2.0 conference, which got bought by HIMSS.
Yep, and then which just turned into a whole massive thing. It's interesting to see how a lot of that stuff kind of snowballed, and I do think that there has been this kind of march of progress, right? I think there have always been pockets of that industry that kind of got it, right? That got where the power was going to be and got where the next steps kind of should be. And were there, so let me ask you this question. So were there people early on that you kind of knew that just got it, right? Even though there may have been things that didn't quite fit, and maybe organizationally not everything was there, but were there people within the organization that you could say, this guy or this woman gets it, and these people know where the next things are going to be? Because I feel like there are people like that have kind of written each subsequent chapter of what we've done digitally.
Yeah, definitely there were. And I will say that, a lot of the people that I connected with that really got what I was doing and understood where I was going were the people that were also trying to do what I was doing in their own companies. So there was a guy, Mark Monso, who was at J&J, who started their first blog and really was the lead social media person at J&J when it first all started. There was a guy named John Pugh, who was at Boehringer Ingelheim, who managed their Twitter and all their social platforms. And so they're still good friends. In fact, I went on vacation with them a couple of months ago. So, but this was almost 20 years ago when we were all trying to do this. And so there were people that really I connected with that really understood. But I'll tell you, the people that really, I think, provided the most insight for what was needed and where things need to go were the patients. There was a huge, surge of patients coming on social to say, these are the problems with what we have now, and what we need is a fix for this, right? And I think the biggest community with the loudest voice, and until this day, they're probably the most advanced condition in terms of their patients being involved in fixing their own challenges, is the diabetes community. They were certainly very early on, on social media, and they all got together. And today they're still a loud voice, and a lot of these patients or people with diabetes have gone on to even start their own companies to solve for some of those challenges themselves.
Yeah. Well, diabetes as a community is both the type 1 and type 2 communities are really interesting, because you actually there's a level of adherence. There's discrete measurements where you actually are tracking what you're doing. And there's a lot of steps that are, I think, well-defined is the word that I would use. It's a little bit different than the communities where you have this diagnostic journey where, for many, in many cases, people don't know what they have. In a lot of ways, the diabetes community is a great example here, because you do know what you have, you do know what you manage and how you manage it. And there's that kind of shared experience, because, what you're supposed to do is not entirely set in stone, but it's very, very similar. The things are discrete and recognizable, and that creates a shared experience in that community. And it's interesting that, that's a really good place to start. And I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about what you thought were some of the inflection points for when, I will say, biopharma writ large as an industry really kind of started to get where the power was, or how powerful this could be? And I realize it's not perfect yet, but I think there have been some good steps in terms of thinking about, okay, we can actually, if we do this and if we leverage this in this way, we can actually make certain things better.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think there's probably been little inflection points along the way over the last 15 years or so. I think the first one was just acknowledging that this thing called the internet was something they needed to be a part of. And even though there's hesitance at the start, it became quite easy, even though some of the early websites looked more like uploaded PDFs, right? There was no real thought about user experience. And so I think the fact that they got onto the internet and now it's become everybody has to be there is one inflection point. The second one was where social media, instead of what they thought of as just another passing fad, became just an important part of what they do, I think was the other inflection point. And why that was most important was because of social listening, because they really finally started to hear unfiltered, unencumbered, unbiased opinions coming directly from all their different patient groups and customers, right? Whether it's payers or providers or anybody else, like really hearing that. And if you know pharma, a lot of times they don't want to hear a lot of these unfiltered conversations because of potential adverse event reporting in case of non-compliance and things like that. And so there's a lot of reasons why it wasn't traditionally looked at. And a lot of the focus was just behind the glass. Traditional market research was how they got their opinions and direction. But social listening, I think, really opened that up to be much more insightful, because it wasn't led, it wasn't directed, it was something that was just unfiltered, and you looked at more about the data and how the pain points that were the pattern recognition, rather than the actual, like, let me ask a question and one person's going to answer it.
So how did you see the evolution of communicating to, say, like, key opinion leaders? I'm thinking your uploaded PDF, right? You're maybe prescribing information And you think about physicians as the learned intermediary, right? Is the term we use, right, to talk to patients. How did the companies you've worked with go from being comfortable maybe sharing information to, say, physicians, then to sharing information to the public and patients and parents and caregivers writ large?
Yeah, I think, traditionally pharma has been much more comfortable with, speaking to healthcare professionals and therefore directing a lot of their materials and messages towards them. Remember, pharma is a very strange organization when it comes to who their actual customer is, because they have one customer that they sell to, one customer that pays for it, and one customer that actually uses their product. So
Yep.
there's a lot of different parties that are involved and who you have to engage for different reasons. I think direct to patient type of marketing or messaging or education started becoming much more important. I remember one of the companies I worked at, we were coming up with one of the first new treatments for hepatitis C. And a big part of that was really just the education of who was at risk. And so then, the rise of the unbranded campaign became really important, because you needed the education for people to even know that they were at risk before they would even get diagnosed. And if they're
Yeah.
not diagnosed, they're not going to go for a treatment. So
Yeah.
how do you start to educate them? Because you really need to understand the cost of not knowing. And so there were things that were brought in from, for example, the healthcare economic side, where we looked at the long-term impact of not knowing and not being diagnosed. And the end result might be, liver cirrhosis and transplant that's needed, which costs much more than if you were to get this treatment now. So, we were looking at those kinds of impacts and really educating patients, providers, payers on these kinds of issues. And I think that unbranded campaign started becoming something that really started to help patients understand their conditions better and empower them. And I think adding social to that also helped them connect and feel much more like they're not just being talked to, but that they could be, have a conversation with.
Right.
Yeah.
And with other patients too, right?
Yes.
Others that,
Exactly. And
So
I'm
if
not
we
sure we've
can,
even got to digital health yet.
not really. We're getting there. We're getting there. So I did have a question here about, when you think you had said earlier you met the early people and ended up being the leaders within the digital health industry, the people that got it, et cetera. So let's call them kind of super users for a moment. And I think you're in any new medium, you're always going to have these people that push the envelope and really get this level of competence and fluency. Do you feel like we are evolving to the point where we're getting better at either A, not leaving people out, or B, kind of knowing who we don't reach, right? Because I think that's a big issue. We can get we know the super users, right? We could probably rattle off the social media handles now, but are we getting better at getting to the people that are less literate, less digitally literate, and less really in tune with all of that?
Yeah, I think in the last maybe 5 to 8 years, maybe there's been much more of a push for making sure that we engage people at all levels. Certainly, the digital literacy topic has been brought up a lot, but it was about more the internal folks understanding what that really meant. It
Right.
wasn't just about making sure you don't use words and phrases that are very difficult to understand, that you have it at a certain level for the basic literacy. It's not just that, it's also the user experience and how you create the entire experience of using your website or your product in a
Right.
way that is much more easy to consume. So there were those types of things that became important. And then in the last, I'd say 2 or 3 years, what's really been a huge driver of this has been the whole need for diversity and inclusion, equity
Yeah.
and access. That's
Right.
really been the big push for how do we reach all these segments that aren't reached,
Mhm.
especially in the clinical trial space where we see such a bias towards the types of populations we recruit.
Yeah.
That's become a top of mind for every pharma company now, which is, how do we include more minority populations? How do we make it more accessible? the whole idea of decentralized trials is to really make it so that everyone has access, and not just the ones that can make it to the trial site, the academic center, miles and miles away. So I think there's definitely a push in that direction over the last like 3 or 4 years.
Yep.
And do you think that the pandemic accelerated that because people were at home more and turning toward their computers and social media for information?
Yeah, absolutely. When necessity is the mother of invention, right? And so I think whenever people are put in a place where they don't want to go out, they don't want to have face-to-face connections, they look for every other means by which they can actually get what they need. And I think it was particularly tough on people that needed to go for regular, health visits, whether it was critical or even just to make sure that they're okay. And so then, you saw the telehealth numbers, for example, rise from the low teens to suddenly 80-90% adoption because there was no other way to do it. And so that definitely, if anything, drove the experience for people to realize it's actually pretty good. It's not a bad experience to have this. And it's super convenient. And so I think the fact that people didn't do it before was not so much that it wasn't a good channel. It was the fact that they hadn't experienced it and didn't realize the benefits of being able to do that. And then because, with the big push of remote devices, remote patient monitoring, wearables, and so on, the ability to then collect data, from a distance without requiring them to come in. Like, do you really need a patient to come in, sit in the waiting room for hours, and then finally get into the clinic for a blood pressure measurement or heart rate and so on? Like, can't we do that from home? It's like, there's a few of these things where people are realizing actually it's much more convenient, and in fact it's a much more natural setting, and therefore you're getting a more accurate reading, and you're getting higher resolution because you're doing it every day. And so there are a lot of these benefits that suddenly became very obvious when the pandemic hit.
It's also really easy to discount something that you've never used, right? I mean, I remember in the beginning of the pandemic thinking, that I love meeting people in person. There's so much that goes into that. Never gonna enjoy Zoom as a platform. And after not a long time, I'm like, this actually works really well. That was a really silly opinion. This actually works great. And I know people that had the same perceptions about telehealth that felt exactly the same way. Right. And I think it's the things that you associate going to the doctors with the waiting room and all of the other stuff, and it's just something you're used to giving up in order to do that. And then when you don't have to do it anymore, you realize like, oh, it's actually a really big deal to not have to do that anymore.
And providers were forced to try it too, right?
Yeah.
So it almost took something that required both, the provider and the recipient to take that chance.
But I do think the biggest change that made that possible was the regulations, right? So one, when they started regulations or reimbursement, I would say. So one, when they started taking away state lines as as a limiting factor for doctors as consultants, that really helped the telehealth industry. Second of all, when they started reimbursing telehealth, that made it huge motivation for them to start using it. So I think those two factors combined with the entire situation in the world really drove adoption much quicker than ever. And I think that just goes to show how complicated healthcare is, and the adoption of these new things, and how it requires a whole different set of things to come together to really make things accelerate.
Yeah, because even if you talk to people about telehealth before this, they're like, yeah, we would love to do it. We're actually really good at it, but we're not allowed to do it across state. We can't do it across state lines. We can't get paid for it. So how are we supposed to do this? When you take away those two big barriers, they're like, yeah, we can now do this. We can go ahead full bore. So we actually have a couple of questions here, and I'll start with the first one here. So
give me an easy one.
Okay, here, softball. What digital health platforms and technologies are you most impressed by, and why?
Ooh, that's a hard one. There's just so much out there, and I'm so impressed by so many things. For me, for a while, what was a game changer, this was probably going back about 7-8 years ago, was what I call conversational AI. So chatbots and voice bots, to me, is really interesting because they were starting to create these conversational platforms that reacted based on your comments, on your responses, right? So it wasn't just an FAQ, which you have to read to find what your question is. It was responding to questions or statements that you put into the chat box. And the reason that was important was because pharma has a ton of pre-approved materials because they can only talk about what's been approved by their legal and regulatory team, right? So whether you call them standard response letters that they send to patients and doctors, or medical information teams that have binders full of answers for doctors based on their questions. What if you could take all that and put it into a decision tree type format, put AI and ML on top of it, and make it accessible to everybody all the time?
Right.
How much easier is that, rather than saying, okay, you got to call the patient hotline, but they're only available from 9 to 5 when you're at work, by the way. And so, and also when you call, we've only got 3 nurses manning the line, and therefore, you might not be able to get one for a little while, or you have 17 choices on the phone and press 1 for this, press 2 for that. It's like,
you're like, I don't know, I got more than one.
Yeah, exactly. Let me go book an airline ticket because it's the same process. But I think that to me was a game changer at the time. I'd say, AI and ML is the underlying basis for all things now. And so there's almost no digital health platform that doesn't have some level of that. So that's been a game changer, and that evolves every day. Obviously, there are challenges out with that, both in terms of data privacy, as well as bias and so on, and the need for good data in before you get good data out, things like that. But it is the underlying platform. So that's really big as well. And then digital therapeutics as a whole has been fascinating and something I'm passionate about. Because at what point in time did we think that an app would be able to actually help you drive better outcomes, right? Not just teach you to be adherent, but actually allow you to actually get better, drive better health outcomes, with clinical evidence to support it. And that's what a lot of these digital therapeutics are starting to show now. The ones that are validated are showing they actually can do better. I mean, you've got companies like Omada, I think, was one of the early ones that showed, with type 2 diabetes, it's reversible, and you can actually reverse that with a digital therapeutic. So things like that are really exciting as well.
Yeah, I think between the 2 things that stick out in my mind, I think I remember Akili Health, basically, and it was PureTech that did this deal, but they basically said, yeah, we're gonna go through a real clinical trial. And we're gonna actually put our numbers up against standard of care, which was huge. And the other one that sticks out in my mind is Virta Health, again, with diabetes. And what they had done is they literally published the results of year 1 and year 2 in the New England Journal of Medicine. And it was amazing. The results were off the charts, amazing. HbA1c drops, basically reversing type 2 diabetes in a number of people. I think those are really kind of the 2 big things, because now you had real evidence, right? Now you had data to argue over, and the data was good, right? And that actually helps a lot of arguments, and I think sways a lot of opinions, because you have people willing to back it up with actual patient outcomes.
Absolutely. And of course, we talked about decentralized trials. I think the fact that we're going through this world, we're doing remote patient monitoring, people are able to actually stay at home and still get that benefit of being monitored and being alerted if something goes wrong, I think or even just collection of data in that form versus needing to travel a long distance and wait a long time before they get seen for a short while. That's a huge game changer for the patient experience and the burden that's usually put on the patient as well.
Yeah. Even as we think a lot about New York, obviously, even here we have such rich diversity, right, within our population, but it still isn't easy to get from, say, the far Rockaways to the Upper West Side, right? And so we a lot of times I think we when we say, okay, well, decentralized means you can spread across the country, but it also means you can spread within a smaller geographic area that still has transportation challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you one experience there, which is, there was one time I flew from Boston, and the only flight I could get was to JFK, and it took longer for me to get from JFK to Manhattan than it did for me to fly from Boston to JFK.
Yeah. welcome to landing at JFK in the morning, right? I mean, that's just not fun for anyone. I think one of the big things here is we've started to change access from a top line revenue number to actually a richer piece of data, which is which people are we getting to, and how are we getting to everyone that needs it, right? I think we are getting much smarter about access, where it's not just the number of people that get your therapy, whatever it is, but who gets it and how do you get to them, which I think is really important. I think just the fact that we're recognizing that we couldn't get to everybody, but it's important to try to, is really important for the industry.
Yeah, I think to that point, Eric, the whole idea of personalized medicine, I think we're coming to a new era of, as a result of all the data and AI and ML that we have right now, between social determinants of health, omics data, and the ability to combine a lot of these data sets to have a much more holistic view of a single patient or a segment, as well as longitudinal data that helps you understand where, the outcomes for each type of segment. I think that's becoming huge. And then, of course, you combine that with things like digital biomarkers, which are, going to be a game changer, because they're going to detect and find anomalies in you before you even realize that there's something wrong with you. And I call that the minimum viable delta, right? Like, when do I go from a normal trajectory to actually being something that might lead to a condition or some kind of health issue? We're getting to that point by having wearables in our pocket or on our wrist, and being monitored all the time allows us to find those anomalies quickly.
We had a question about how biopharma is warming up. I would add exploring, right, the concept of the metaverse, and what applications do you see across, I guess, the different modalities that will make up what we'll call the metaverse?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think right now I haven't been too hot on metaverse as an application, outside of maybe an educational type of setting where, I have a good friend in the UK. He's a world-renowned surgeon and virtual surgeon, I should say, too. And his name's Shafi Ahmed, and he actually does like surgery classes and instruction via the metaverse. And he used to do that via VR headsets and so on. And even with Snap goggles, he's done it before. And so, I think that's a really interesting application for the ability to teach, to learn, to instruct in that space. But if you zoom out just a little bit, and think about the metaverse as part of the Web3 movement, and Web3 can include things that are sort of blockchain enabled, like NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which a lot of people just associate with weird art pieces online, and like, why can't I just screenshot that, And then there's also the whole idea of DAOs, which I know we're going to get to in a little bit.
We're going to get there. Yeah.
Decentralized autonomous organizations. But I think that's where there's a really interesting opportunity for healthcare. But the metaverse at this point, I think, is a little bit more limited to more of the educate. It's sort of like where the web was in the beginning, where it was much more one way, and the opportunity was more educational and instructional. We haven't, I think, found a good way to really leverage that to really drive better outcomes at this point, in my opinion. But I'm sure there are a lot of people working on that.
I think if we think about kind of groups of people, the way that I think about this is there are probably larger blocks of people that are closer to being able to connect to the internet and connect to standard digital tools than there are large blocks of people that are going to start to explore VR and the metaverse. Whatever. I really feel like we're on the pretty far left side of the Gaussian on that one. Again,
I will say, sorry, Derek,
no,
I was just going to say, the one thing I do think is really interesting, though, and whether you call this metaverse or just pure VR, is where the role VR is playing in, for example, pain reduction. I think is really interesting. There's been a lot of clinical evidence around that. There's a guy called Brennan Spiegel, and I think today's actually his birthday. But
happy birthday, Brennan!
Brennan does a lot of research in I think he's in Cedars-Sinai in LA, on the ability for VR headsets and the application for VR headsets as a therapeutic to reduce pain levels in patients that normally would otherwise have to be given a pharmacologic. And we know the challenge with that, with the opioid crisis and so on. So the more we can find tools that replace that that need for something of an addictive substance and so on, the better it is for patients at the end of the day, and the more accessible it is to patients.
Yeah, no, I would separate in my mind VR as kind of either a digital therapeutic or a tool for a few certain things that I really, really like, and the kind of broader concept of, everyone jumping into the metaverse. I really like the former, and I think we're really early in the latter.
Yeah,
exactly. I agree.
Yeah.
We actually had a question that just came in while you were talking about digital therapy. What are the opportunities where there's still an unmet need or lower saturation of digital solutions? And you just gave one, right, which was in pain management. Are there any others that stick out to you that?
There's almost a startup for everything you can think of these days, and some which I never even knew existed, I'm starting to see. I think rare diseases might be one where, maybe, pharma has traditionally invested based on, what they think is profitable, for very good reasons, because you need that profit to continue R&D, to continue manufacturing, to continue all the things that they need to be a sustainable business. And rare diseases might not be it might be much harder to have a sustainable business built around that, even though there are some companies that focus on that. So I would say rare diseases definitely is an area which might be more underserved. I think also how you can get more equitable treatments to a broader population is another one, especially if you think about some conditions which may have a genetic or geographical or even cultural bias as a result of, like sickle cell disease affects a certain population more than others. How do you start to be able to focus on the fact that you need to address that population and really personalize the treatments towards them, because that's a greatest population that actually is affected by that. Things like that, I think, are really important and underserved right now.
Yeah. So I want to pivot a little bit here because we still need to get to DAOs in a sec, but lightning round question, right? So I think there is an entire startup universe that has, been brought up to the point where, biopharma is the customer in a sense, right? These can be either discovery applications or clinical trials applications. So do you think biopharma is getting smarter about how to either use those, partner with those, and almost get smarter about a build versus buy option there?
Yeah, I think, certainly in the last, I'd say 5 years or so, there's been a huge change in the way we approach that. And certainly before it was always like, we need to build it in-house, we need to build it in-house. And suddenly with, I think, the recognition that all these startups are solving for challenges that we were already starting to look at, why, try to reinvent the wheel when somebody's already got, further ahead with it. And especially the rise of all these corporate business development teams that are basically strategic investors in these companies. How can we start to really influence some of the direction of what they're doing and take our experience, expertise, and sometimes even clinical data that we have to help shape that company in a way that allows them to actually serve the purpose that we're looking at as well as a pharma company. So I think that's really changed over the years. I think now every pharma company almost is partnering with a startup in some form or fashion. In my last role, my job was to basically work with the senior leaders in each business unit, so R&D, clinical, commercial, manufacturing, supply chain, to help drive their innovation strategy, understand their business problems, and then connect with the digital ecosystem at large to try and bring in those solution partners that could potentially solve their challenges and really start to validate that they can before we actually start to invest in them in some form.
Yeah. Okay. So should we pivot? Should we talk about South by Southwest and talk about where we might be going with Web3 and and DAOs? Because we had a side conversation about this. Why don't you throw up the topic of the panel and let's get into it a little bit.
Sure. So first of all, I'll say that I've been involved with South by Southwest for the last 12 years or so. So I've been going there annually and running health tech startup events, participating in panels, running 3 to half-day events depending on what's happening that year. And this year I'm pretty excited because I haven't actually submitted a panel submission in a long time. Usually I'll run an event instead. But this time I decided to submit a panel because I'm pretty excited about this topic, which is, will DAOs be the future of medical innovation? And I've partnered with a few panelists. One is a good friend of mine called Jen Horenjeff, who runs a patient co-op called Savvy Co-op, and basically is a I hate to label it as a patient advocacy community, but she works with patients to help inform what patient needs are. And then the other group is a group that I'm talking to about advising them. They're called Axon DAO, so they're a DAO that's really focused on medical investments. And just to clarify with everybody, a DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, which is a bit like a co-op where everybody is part owner of the fund, so to speak.
Yeah,
Right.
Jen has also been a breakfast guest on our show. So yeah,
and she's local.
She is, and we've met her puppets too.
Oh, great. Yep.
She's a force of nature. So it's interesting because this taps into the entire Web3 movement. It really kind of gets to the question: how do different organizations move the needle in terms of funding and advancing innovation, right? Because we've talked a lot about biopharma and other groups being able to listen to patients, right? And this is really a much more kind of active thing where these groups would control, in a sense, or spur innovation directly via being able to mobilize funding, right? And what's interesting is we traded things on this the other day, but I was really surprised to see this announcement that Pfizer Ventures just actually invested $500,000 in a group called VitaDAO, which I'll now put into the chat. And that to me is a big signal that this is not really out there. This is something that's going to be able to be validated, is probably going to pull in more traditional sources of funding. And I think it's a really exciting potential outlet for more to get done. I think the whole industry, if you think about it, there's so much that's driven by traditional venture capital, which does really, really good things, but they don't do everything, right? And this is kind of another, I don't love the term democratized, but it's a bit more democratized source where they can do things that this community really believes matters to them.
Yeah, it's part of I think the movement that they sort of label it under is called DeSci, or decentralized science.
Yeah.
And the ability to have a fund that is co-owned by a lot of people within the DAO to drive investments in areas which they're most interested in. A good correlate to this might be before any of these terms ever existed, Vertex Pharmaceuticals actually was founded on the principle of funding from a cystic fibrosis organization, a patient advocacy organization, in order to do the research to find a treatment for cystic fibrosis. And at least that's what I understand from my time there, and it may be a total myth, but my understanding is that's a lot of the funding that came initially to actually develop that research, which ended up developing a treatment. Initially, when the first treatment came out, I think it could help about 5% of the population, but now I think it helps like 95%. But that is the power of having a group that is able to invest in what matters most to them, because the cystic fibrosis affects a lot of children, and children aren't able to reach the age of 2 sometimes as a result of that. And so if you can provide the vehicle by which you drive incentive and motivation to find a treatment and cure for that condition, why not leverage that? So I see DAOs having a similar correlate to what I remember from that example with cystic fibrosis and Vertex.
I think it's a logical extension of kind of the foundation-driven venture funds. And if you think about it, if you think about the folks that drive venture funding, they are highly educated people. They drive down an investment thesis. They vet all of the things that they can do. I remember we had Gay Grossman on here. If you talk to anyone who is a parent or a caregiver for anyone with rare disease, if you talk to people within these communities, many of them have the same knowledge that, various partners in venture would have, perhaps without the PhD attached to their name. But, these are people that are highly educated, or, they live the challenge every day. And, it's really a very logical step to say, we can make intelligent, informed decisions about where things should go for how to make this disease better. To me, it's a very logical next step that I think almost gets muddied by really the NFT craze and things like that are, you have these speculative markets over here, and I think this is really kind of anything but.
Yeah, and it's still new, so everybody's still trying to figure out how to best leverage these platforms and vehicles, and everybody's trying to understand the value it can create. So I think the interesting thing is, Derek, are we switching over to the DAO conversation now? I think we can focus on
yeah,
that,
we're
right?
there.
Yeah, okay.
We're there.
So I think the interesting thing about the DAOs and the ability to assign a token, for example, is it can, on one hand, be a voting right. On another hand, it can contain value, like a share or stock option, and then it can also contain data, right? And so the whole idea of tokenization is to be able to assign some kind of value to it, depending on what that group wants it to represent. And could it also be a way, because it's all blockchain enabled, a way to allow patients to regain control of their data? Because traditionally, when patients go for clinical trials, a lot of that data, and in fact most of that data, goes back to the sponsor organization, the pharma company, and never to be seen again, and the patients don't get any of it, right? What if in the future, as a result of being part of a DAO, and maybe my data being stored on a token, I have control of my own data, and whether I leverage it for my own health or I could contribute it to a future research, is that something that a DAO could start to drive as a result of that?
And then we actually had a question that fits in nicely here. It says, in tackling the risk and enhancing reimbursement for payers, what are your thoughts on next steps with smart contracting using the blockchain, which you just touched on? So talk to us about how that plays further throughout the ecosystem. You've talked about a patient holding their data and putting that on a blockchain to do with as they see fit. Talk to us about how other users of the ecosystem would access information.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting question, because I think that the first real application of blockchain that that was discussed many years ago was just the whole idea of smart contracting and the ability to validate and verify that it hasn't been tampered with. And so I think that's a very different use case of blockchain, where it's much more about compliance and legal sort of validation. And I think that's part of the broader use case for blockchain. I think in this case, it's a little bit more around the investment side, around the ability to store data. Or maybe I just haven't understood that world enough to know where these two worlds kind of collide.
Yeah.
But I would say that the smart contracting piece, in my mind at least, was much more about just making sure that it was not tampered with, instead of going to a notary public or some kind of intermediary that validates both sides. How can smart contracting allow for a much quicker ability to validate a contract?
Yeah. I think this might be another area where, almost like telehealth, where it needs either the quote unquote killer app, or it needs this initial uptake in order to show people that it could work, right? Because I think there's been people that are smart about blockchain for a long time, and we've been talking about blockchain and health for a long time, and the question has always been, okay, where is it going to start? And maybe it's something like a DAO that gives it that opportunity, because as you can imagine, that I think the things that the DAOs are going to have to deal with is really the organizational piece, right? You don't want to see things started and then fall apart because the DAO itself didn't have the actual organizational stuff figured out. But I think if they get to the point where you have ones that are really well organized and actually have the smart blockchain stuff figured out on the back end, where that part is seamless. Either the patients own their data, and then like somehow people are accessed. That marketplace starts to work. I think that's actually super important for proving out that use case for blockchain in healthcare.
Agreed. And you know, I think it's found its use case in currency and
Yeah.
finance, obviously.
Yes.
I think it's also to a lesser extent, or at least lesser known extent, found its way into supply chain and validation of products and so on. But I think in this case, what we're talking about is a very different application.
Hmm. Yeah, and there is this groundswell of, you know, the patient should own their data, right? Everyone, all the health systems have rules over, if you ask for your data, we have to give it to you, et cetera. And it seems like the logical extension of your data is your data. And, you know, ultimately, I think, and we've had a lot of opinions on, you know, this program, but everyone seems to think that that's where it's going, that the patient will own their data. I think collectively, it just, there needs to be a way to figure out how that actually happens.
Yeah, and we've also got to find a way to allow our data to be able to talk from one system to another system, right?
Yes.
That's the other challenge. Is you know, we can't even get one EHR system to talk to another one right now. Never mind the fact that we're trying to empower patients with giving them the data.
That's a whole. This has been fun because literally I have my notes from our previous stuff next to me, and it's always a good conversation when we leave half of them on the cutting room floor, which we have here. But that discussion in and of itself, that didn't even make it into our notes, and that's a whole other hour.
Yep.
So Shwen, so as you look ahead, beyond your panel discussion at South by Southwest, what is the most aspirational and yet achievable use of DAOs over the next, say, 5 years?
Yeah.
Well, I think the what's achievable is going to be around the investment front. I think as long as they establish it right, they set up the right vehicle and follow all the regulatory requirements for setting up a vehicle to do investments. I think that's very achievable. It's just a matter of getting everybody aligned and on board with where they want to invest and how they're going to invest and how much. So I think that's going to be a good one, and it'll be interesting seeing how that's returned as well at the end of the day. I think whether that actually yields a actual treatment cure solution that actually drives better outcomes or you know, better health for people, that's going to be much more longer term, because as you know, it takes a while to bring any treatment to market, maybe less so with digital therapeutics, but even then it's a few years before it plays out. So in the next 5 years, I think the investment part possible. I think the data part may be possible as well, where patients are able to store some kind of data as well. But in terms of the actual, like, does it actually drive a cure or treatment in some form as a result of the DAO investment? That's probably a little longer term.
Yeah. Yeah, no, biology is a very, very large foe waiting at the end of whatever gate you open there. And that's, you know, that's difficult in the best of times.
Yeah.
We only have a few minutes left, but we did have I'm going to flip our conversation about the benefits of digital health on our head with a question from a participant. Do you think there are any major risks of the quickly expanding use of digital health?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the big risks, especially with the way funding was about 9 months ago, I won't say is, but was about 9 months ago, is there's so much land grabbing of like, we just need to invest in a digital health company. But I think there was a recent report which came out, and I think Rock Health published it, which kind of showed that, you know, 90% of all digital health companies have no validation for the outcomes that they actually should drive, which I think is the danger, because some of these look really cool in concept, but until you actually show that it's demonstrated to drive a clinical outcome or a patient outcome, is it really worth anything, right? So that's what I think the biggest danger is the fact that we're so hyped up and excited about the tech that we forget that at the end of the day, that tech is to serve the purpose of driving a better patient outcome. And we need to make sure that it's able to do that and validate it in order for us to be successful in this space. And that's, I think, a danger that, you know, we all like shiny new toys.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you've kind of nailed like what I think is the fundamental challenge of digital health in the next 5 years, which is to transition from the benchmark of eyeballs and users to actual outcomes. And that's harder, right? It's a fundamental, shift in needing to do things from a regulatory perspective. So I'll ask you this: do you think that there are the right people around the table now, and maybe the funding environment comes into this too? Do we have the right conditions to really start to do that? Do you think the industry gets it and is going to start to drill down?
I think they do now, or at least they do much better than they did before. I think before it was a bit of a, let's dip our toe in the water and just try to have some investments here, some investments there, or let's try this. I think there's a better approach to that. I think part of the big danger sometimes with the way biopharma works is a lot of it's driven by the commercial marketing teams, and sometimes there's this what's the best way to describe it? I think there's a mix between what is truly going to drive a better outcome versus what looks promotional and drives a good brand or positioning or drives hype, right? So what is good PR versus what actually drives a better outcome? And also, how do you start to validate these things much earlier in the life cycle? So a lot of times, a lot of these solutions get brought in only after a drug has been approved for production and marketing. And so do we need to start earlier so that by the time that drug comes to market, we've actually demonstrated that it actually can help to drive better outcomes using that platform? And I think the question becomes also, should we be investing in standalone digital therapeutics or digital companions for our current compounds, or something, in between? So that's another question that has to be figured out.
Yeah. Okay. We have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to give you an ambitious final question to close us out on.
Uh-oh.
Right. I am the CEO of the largest biopharma company in the world, and I call you up and I say, I'm going to hire you tomorrow, and I want you to come in to do the most radical and impactful thing you can think of. You have blue sky, clear slate. You could do anything that you want, and I want you to be bold. What is the thing that you do?
Whoa, that's a loaded question, and I only got
Sure
a minute
is.
and a half to answer it.
Sure is. No, you got to be quick.
Yeah, I think the one thing we recognize in biopharma is that we're really efficient and made to really function as a drug manufacturer. We're really good at that. What we haven't really developed internally in most companies is the ability to develop digital products. And to me, that is a huge part of trying to get into this space, is understanding how to develop digital products, including the long-term maintenance and operations of a digital platform. Tech companies get that because that's what they do. That's their business. Pharma companies don't. And that's, I think, a big part of it. And it requires talent, cultural change, investment in more experimentation and agile methods, and people that actually understand how to actually maintain a digital product.
The proverbial meeting in the middle of all of the goals, right?
Yeah.
Shwen, thank you so much today. This was amazing. And now we're all gonna be in Austin in March to watch your panel.
Great.
Looking forward to seeing everybody there.
Awesome.
We really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Have a good Tuesday. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Shwen.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.